Hey, it's Will Shannon here, and today we're going to talk about Tony Robbins' Unlimited Power. The first thing is this book, again, like his other book, Awaken the Giant Within, is a huge book. It's about 400 pages. Awaken the Giant Within is 500 and something pages with very small print. And Tony Robbins often says that people need to be what he calls cognitive misers to read his book, which is a fancy word for saying you need to be able to want to study things in depth. The foreword is written by Ken Blanchard, who wrote The 1 Minute Manager. And the first thing that struck me about this book is the fact that it looks like Tony Robbins has written this forward and Ken Blanchard has simply put his name on it. I've heard on his personal power tapes Ken Blanchard give him a forward, and it certainly sounds like Ken Blanchard is just reading from a piece of paper. Tony talks about Tony having charisma and charm, and talking about how at the age of 25 he's already the leading motivational speaker, and whose thoughts go beyond that. Now, this book was written in 1986, but universal principles are universal principles. He talks about the commodity of kings, and he starts off talking about for every effort you put in there's a multiple reward. So he talks about starting with the law of cause and effect, and then he uses examples of Steven Spielberg, who at the age of 36 is already the most successful filmmaker in history. He talks about the ultimate success formula, which is to know what you want, decide to accomplish it, take action, and then have the sensory acuity to change your approach. And he references his book with amazing people: Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, Steven Spielberg, Bruce Springsteen. And he says they all share certain traits, that they're passionate about what they do, they have belief, they have a strategy, and they know how to do it. They're clear about what's important to them. Do they value health? Do they value success? They have energy, and they have the ability to communicate with others and themselves. He basically outlines that his book is basically basically skills and strategies, and basically he talks about how people told him to split up the book into two, and he didn't choose to do that. He goes into the difference that makes a difference and introduces NLP. He says the basis of NLP is basically your state. Your state is made up of your physiology and internal representations. He now calls this focus, as in what our visual, auditory, and feeling, what we picture, what we say to ourselves, and what we feel, and also our physiology, our posture, our breathing, our tension. And he said, and this goes in and basically creates our behaviour. So our state or our emotion is what drives our behaviour, and that's obviously the foundation of NLP. Then he talks about the fact that we need to have empowering beliefs. We need to believe that everything happens for a reason and a purpose, and it serves. We need to believe there's no such thing as failure. He says we need to have the belief that whatever happens, we take responsibility. And we need to have the belief that we don't even need to understand everything to use it. He says have the belief that people are your greatest resource, and that you're not going to get what you want without commitment. Then he goes into how to run your brain, and he talks about pictures, sounds, and feelings, and using submodalities to alter how you feel. He goes into syntax or strategies, which is basically a fancy word for sequence of how we think. So they then take the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic senses and give them an order. So maybe you picture something, then you say something, and he gives the example of the strategy of a good speller, and good spellers visualize the words. He says then you need to know what other people are thinking about, and you need to take that so you can copy it. He then goes into physiology and introduces some of his early health principles, and as you know, he was very health driven. The first thing he talks about, which I think is extremely accurate, is the power of breath. It's very rare to find anyone who'll talk about the power of breath and oxygen first. He then goes into reference Paul Ekman, and references Paul Ekman's work to do with the face and physiology, and that we can use our breathing and our facial expressions to change how we feel. In other words, our brain and our body are in a cybernetic loop. He then goes in to talk about health more in depth, which is we should eat water-rich foods, which is like vegetables and some fruit. This is, of course, after breath. He talks about food combining, not mixing proteins and starches. He used to talk about eating fruit till midday, which was later they let go of, and that was a fit for life principle. And then talk about setting goals, and if you want to get what you want, you set goals and you be very specific. And he talks about the best chapter in this book, outside of motivational speaking to do with NLP, is chapter 7, which is the power of precision. He teaches you how to memorize on each hand what they call the meta model or the precision model, which is a way of asking questions to others to elicit very specific information. He goes in to talk about rapport and matching and mirroring. In order to get rapport with people, we should be copying their behaviors outside of conscious awareness. He talks about it could be their tonality, their pitch, or it could be visual, their head position. The most important thing to copy is people's breathing. He then explains an NLP process called meta programs. And meta programs are an idea of, do people move towards things, towards pleasure, or away from pain more? Do they operate from an internal frame of reference like leaders do, or external and reliant on everyone else? Do they sort by themselves, or do they sort by others? Do they match, or do they mismatch, which means do they sort for similarities, or do they sort for difference? And do they look at, or do they do what's possibility, what's possible, or what's necessity? Necessity, people are very stressed, and possibility, people are very driven. He then talks about solving problems by focusing on a solution and finding agreement with others by saying things like I appreciate and I respect and I agree and, which they call in NLP an agreement frame. He goes into talk about reframing. He uses plenty of metaphors throughout the book of reframing things to yourself and others and finding an empowering meaning. Ask what else can this mean, and where else could this be useful in another context, or just changing the content. He then talks about a parts integration, which is a very common NLP technique where you identify the behavior you wish to change and find the positive intention from your unconscious. And then he talks about anchoring, which is very important, that whenever you get yourself in a good state, to set it up with some sort of anchor. And finally, he leads with the challenge of leadership, which is being very clear on what we value. Do we value health? Do we value success? Do we value love? Do we value being beautiful? And really consciously living our life in a way that's most important to us. He then goes in to how to deal with others and talks about you must learn to handle rejection, and that it's just a perception, and that you need to operate with an internal frame of reference. And then he talks about the power of trends and noticing patterns in society. And then how to give back. It's certainly a very, very, very good book for probably the best I've read for understanding NLP. It's very in-depth. It's 400 something pages. You'd have to commit to read a chapter a day or something like that. Half an hour or 20 minutes or an hour. And certainly a very, very powerful book for those interested in NLP and personal development.